With your help, we can continue to fight for freedom, reach new audiences, and bring important information to the public free of charge. This is not possible without your generosity. Join our quest for the truth and our freedom and donate today, telling it as it is. This is today's News Talk, The World Today.
Echo there, so we might just, there's all sorts of noises. Someone's speakers are very, very loud. It's always a nice way to start a remake of Clockwork Orange. And by the way, welcome to The World Today and the Protagonist. We're looking at the super Chinese embassy. Is it a mistake? And we'll look at the fury at the moment over that. Now, the Starmer government has just approved the super Chinese embassy on the former Royal Mint site bought by China in 2018. I think it was 255 million quid. Now, this will create Europe's largest embassy at 20,000 square metres with refurbished historic buildings and deep basements, making it a virtual intelligence hub. Controversy over the project centred on its location over sensitive fibre optic cables carrying the City of London data. Commentators state the site will be used to spy on Britain, access all communications into the City of London and millions of personal emails. Some Conservative MPs have labelled it a security lapse. The Shadow Home Secretary has slammed the decision, indicating that Starmer is trading away security in his desperation to appease China. This decision comes on the back of Starmer's surrender of the strategically important Chagos Islands. He can't do much good, can he, really? However, and this is the kicker here, it was the Tories, who are now infiltrating Reform UK, who sold the plot to the Chinese for their new embassy. And the negotiations on Chagos Island started in November 2022 and went on for round after round under the Tories. Has Britain's political class failed in their duty to put the security of the British people first? And why is the UK kowtowing to the Chinese government instead of treating China as an important but equal economic partner? Our guest today, Neil Petrie, former British Army Intelligence and Special Forces officer, Dr. Heiko Khoo. He was a columnist with China.org.cn, a website, a website of China's State Council. I lost myself there. He also holds a doctorate in Chinese political economy and is currently writing a book, Karl Marx and China. And David English, media commentator, formerly a journo with the Epoch Times UK and an anchor for NTD UK News. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me. First of all, Neil, to yourself, can you just tell me your thoughts on the new super embassy that's going to be built very shortly for the Chinese? And do you think its location should have been thought out more, not by the Chinese, but by the British government?
Yeah, well, unfortunately with Starmer, we don't get a lot of real thinking. So, but between them all, they've fouled this up pretty badly. You've got to think the Chinese are acme of skill for them, having learned it from Sun Tzu, is you've got to, try and beat the enemy without fighting. And this is what they're always up to, and they're up to it now, and I actually served in Hong Kong as well a long time ago, when we were... it was a colony at that time. So all I see with this is the Chinese are outsmarting the Brits. They're getting access right above these cables, etc. as well. And if you know your military or your security history, you'll know that the Berlin cables incident long ago in the 40s and 50s was where we penetrated, or the West penetrated into through a tunnel into the cables under the East German border and access their cables that way. And I'm sure the technology the Chinese have these days, there'll be a lot they can do So we've got cables running under this place. It's a massive embassy. I mean, hundreds of millions of pounds, obviously, they've spent on this thing, or will be as well. So we've handed over, but we're doing it routinely now, in the West, and particularly in the UK and Europe, aligning with a communist state that has been, murdering people for generations, continues to do so, and is just trying to, destroy us internally through all the actions that it carries out across the West today, be it drugs over in America or this type of thing in the UK. And we handed over strategically our work, our industries to China a generation ago. When Bill Clinton signed over, the World Trade stuff, etc., and then we ended up allowing these people access in about 2001, I think. And ever since then, we've been completely destroyed economically. We're falling apart economically. We're weak, and that's obviously why Trump is going the way he's going. And in the UK, we're going the other way. We're going to be, little tugging our forelocks to the masters in Beijing. So that's my feeling.
Dr. Heiko Khoo, thank you for joining us. What are your thoughts?
I don't agree with any of the arguments just been made. I don't think China per se, well, I've got a right to disagree with you.
Yeah, you have, yeah.
Yeah. So I don't agree with any of the arguments being made. The Chinese embassy, well, why should they not have an embassy? I've got no reason to believe that there's any threat to national security of Britain from an embassy. In fact, having an embassy at a single location where all the British spies, intel agents, and so on can spy on the Chinese is beneficial in a way to British intelligence. A bit foolish, perhaps, on the part of the Chinese, but why shouldn't they have a large embassy? I've seen the argument about cables and the Berlin Wall and so on. This is old hat. The Chinese don't require to dig into cables in London in order to get access to information. They can find information, open source information through representatives who perhaps work for major corporations, and information that they glean from other intel sources. They don't require any such thing. Whereas, and you're claiming the British are kowtowing to the Chinese, the reality is the main danger in Britain in the last couple of years, clearly exposed, was the influence of Israel in Britain. Britain has been a lapdog to Israeli barbarians carrying out a genocide against the people in Gaza. And they're doing the same thing in relation to Donald Trump's madness in Venezuela, kidnapping the president of the country, which is illegal even under American law. It's illegal. Even if Maduro were found guilty of something, it would still be illegal, a crime which would justify about 20 years in prison in the United States of America. So it's Britain who is acting as a lapdog to whatever the United States and Israel says is right. And China plays no role in this whatsoever. So the hysteria about China is coming from a totally different place. And as you said a minute ago, Neil, you served as an intel officer in Hong Kong. Well, Hong Kong was transferred to the British as a consequence of Britain forcing opium on the Chinese people in 2 wars in the 19th century. So there's a background to all these things that is misunderstood generally by the British people. When the British at the time, when we defeated, the British defeated Hong Kong, defeated the Chinese and seized Hong Kong, Britain was number 1 power in the world. Because China is a rising power and that threatens the authority of the United States and Britain and its allies, that's why the hysteria is being generated.
Again, I have to agree on what mostly you said. It's if you can't have Putin always as the big bad guy, we've also got to have Xi as the big bad guy. And I don't agree with a lot what they say, but a couple on UK column have mentioned that. Tell me the wars that the Chinese have created in the last 20 or 30 years, and then tell me how many the US have done. And I think it's zip to whatever it is. So yes, and maybe Heiko, that we have we're a little bit ignorant in many ways, and because the Chinese, and again I don't agree with everything that people are saying, but I think they're overbeating it up a bit with the Chinese being going to take over the world. I mean, if you look at Taiwan, I think you would agree, and I'm probably talking too much here, but Taiwan was signed off by the UK and other countries a few decades ago that they recognised that Taiwan was part of Beijing. So, and yet they want to save Taiwan from not the Chinese, but the West want to save Taiwan from the Chinese, which is a bit like trying to save California from the Americans. So I think ignorance is in full swing here, and I'm glad you are on, so you can sort of, you can put another side to it, which I do appreciate. David English, what's your thoughts on the new super embassy next to all this sensitive data? And Heiko is right. What they can do, they don't need to get close to cables, so they can do it any other way. Technology is so good.
So the first point is the Chinese already have an embassy in the UK. It's not like they don't have an embassy. They have an embassy on Portland Road. So they have no need for a new one. It raises a lot of questions about individual sovereignty for a start. There are parts of the plans of this building which the government are not privy to. They're secret, classified by the Chinese government. That shouldn't be allowed for a start. You have to look at every individual nation has to put the security of its own people and the needs of its own people first. And why does the Chinese need a mega embassy in the United Kingdom? There is no need for it whatsoever. They only need a handful of attaches and ministers here at any one time. So there's no need to have something that large and that ostentatious. From the outset, if you're going to look at this from the imperial days point of view, it's a show of power. And the Chinese have huge power and influence in the United Kingdom. I think Craig Hamilton, in his book Hidden Hand in 2020, listed the United Kingdom as perhaps the most infiltrated country by Chinese influence in the world. And I think certainly if you look at the background of a lot of the politicians and the investments made by some of the most influential people in the country, I think that's probably correct. I don't agree that Chinese are a benign country. I think you just have to look at their track record of, I think there's more than 80 million innocent Chinese people died since the CCP took over. I think this alone should tell you that there's something not quite right there. We have devastated our country and sent our industries to China en masse in the last 30 years, which is wrong. I don't think we should have the closeness that we do have with the Chinese government. With the Chinese people, yes, I adore the Chinese people and I adore Chinese culture, but I completely distrust the Chinese government. I think it's wrong to make a false equivalence to Britain taking Hong Kong with the Opium Wars, in the sense that the Chinese Communist Party, before it seized power in 1949, made the majority of its money through opium sales to the Chinese people. This is a documented fact. So I don't really agree with those points at all, and I think it's a false equivalence to sort of look at something and say, well, you did something wrong in the past, therefore your point now is invalid. I'm not really sure that's the right way to go about this. We do know that when China started investing in the telecoms infrastructure in, I think it was 2014, 2015, there was concerns then raised by MI5 about security risks. China has previously stated that any chips made in China it wants to have backdoor access to. We know that they're gathering information through platforms like TikTok and other things. So they are a data gathering superpower in a sense. We know that they use their student network for similar things. Overseas students have to report back on various things. I know this firsthand. So, yeah, I personally long for the day when the Chinese Communist Party is gone. I see, you look at their constitution, as Heiko pointed out, that he doesn't believe that they're after some world conglomerate, some world superpower takeover. But it states in the Chinese constitution that it is essentially the destiny of the Chinese to liberate the world, and that no country will be communist until every country is communist. So I'm not really sure how you can defend that point of view and also look at the overreaching dominance of China and not state that there is something else at play there.
Again, I mean, it's an interesting conversation we're having. And by the way, please jump in where you want to, but just keep it fairly civil because I need to go home.
Yeah, if I could maybe add something against some of my thoughts on that, I don't disagree. With some of the things that were said, obviously by Haiku, in terms of when you're looking at the history of it all. Yeah, of course, opium wars and the colonial era. And if we're going to sit and go back over those, we'll go back through many centuries, and we'll be re-invading France. So I'm not really into those arguments, but I do understand, that the details of the tunnel incident are just to illustrate, that once you get near something or access, who knows what they've got today. But the worst of it all is we handed over our industries. We handed over all the IP basically because, since 2015, you cannot extract your profits out of China, any companies, and you'll see Volkswagen became the largest company, a car company in the world. It has now got real problems because, again, you can't take cash out of China. Once you're locked into China as a international trader, away, and I've had experience with this. I used to run a security company, over in the Middle East and also Central Asia, and we had guys from the Singapore office who were trying to set up in China, and they wanted every single piece of IP on your security equipment, your cameras, anything, etc. And that was had to be handed over to the government. This is how they've developed so quickly. And then in 2017, the law was introduced, by the Chinese, that every single Chinese citizen has to report, if asked, to the security services, and if necessary, hand over all the commercial secrets of any company they are working for. These are the issues. You can find out about this in a good book called Stealth War from a National Security Council officer, brigadier, who wrote about it, back in the late, I think it's 2019, the book may have come out. And there's been a lot more since, obviously. But China it's not a friendly partner. As we just heard from David, it has got long-term aims. It is a communist government, and it does use it's a slightly different way of operating to the old Soviet system. Yes, it's the Maoist system, and they're using all of these very sensible and useful strategic techniques. That Sun Tzu, obviously a native of China, gave us, and which we still all study in the military when I was in anyway. So. I understand where Haiku's, what you can talk about imperialism and all the rest of it, and you can talk about the Israeli imperialism or whatever else, but we're talking about an embassy in London, and we're talking about the penetration, as David said, about our society as a whole and our culture. That's my thinking.
Can I ask you, Heiko, just what the long-term aims of the Chinese in the UK, for example, with their super embassy, and a good point was made before, why do we need such a super embassy? I mean, and by the way, super embassy is what is being touted by the media. We know how much the media love a bit of hysteria, so probably way away from the truth, but just looking at what is being said, why do they need a super embassy? And secondly, what do you think, what is the long term, because the Chinese do it very well, they do it, the long game, they're very patient, they haven't, at the moment, and even though if you mentioned Hong Kong, Neil, we do have friends in Hong Kong, and they seem to be, seem to be chugging along quite nicely at this stage. So the obvious massacres and head being chopped off and all that sort of stuff hasn't actually happened. Heiko, what is a long-term plan for China in the UK, and why a super embassy?
I mean, I've been in the Chinese embassy in Portland Place. It's an old embassy. When Sun Yat-sen was in London in the very beginning of the century, he was supposedly kidnapped by the Chinese legation, although that's questioned as well. But it's an old place. It's a rundown old building. And obviously they have security fears, legitimate security fears, because there are a lot of people who make hysterical attacks on China. There's the Uyghur lobby and others who would like to, possibly blow up the embassy and so on, for the same reasons why the Americans require some kind of large embassy, although the American embassy is clearly designed to spy on the British people and has done for decades, spied on the British people and the British government, which Ed Snowden revealed, which WikiLeaks have revealed. I mean, these aren't secrets. And the claims about China and the aspersions about China, when you actually go into them, for example, those made a few minutes ago, they add up to nothing. There's a claim here 80 million died. I think, David said, I don't mean to have a go at you, but you just said, I think 80 million. You can just throw 80 million into the sky and think that's a legitimate claim. It's not a legitimate claim. The country is vast
It is
as
a legitimate claim.
It is legitimate.
well. Where's the
In
source?
fact, it's
So what's the source?
conservative. It's very conservative.
What's the
The topper
source?
estimate is
What's
120
the
million.
source? What's the source for your claim? You say
Well,
80
that's
million. What's
a
the
very
source for your
leftist
claim?
argument, which is
It's not a leftist
you
argument.
have made the point and I'm going to
Ask
pretend to play
for
ignorance in order to answer the point.
verification for a
This has been
claim.
verified. This is literally verified everywhere. You can
Yeah.
go and find it
Name
yourself. It's data,
source then.
various available
Name me
sources of
one
data
source.
from the Chinese
Well-
government themselves.
Name me one.
Yeah, there were 3 books written. I forgot his name now, but he was a professor in Hong Kong, and he had access to the records. And then
Who's
there
he?
was a guy no, I forgot the name of the book as well.
So you don't
It was
know the
written
source.
by if I could say, it's a journalist. Okay, who wrote about it. It's a single. I forgot the name of it now, but I can dig it out for you and send it on. But yeah, there were deep investigations by the journalist concerned. He went all over China and he dug into all the records, and he came up with about 50 million. And the other fella, he wrote this trilogy on China and about Mao's famine, about the he was estimating 40 to 60 million were what they could
Well, it's
confirm.
not 80 million, is it?
No,
40
I'm
to
talking.
60
I'm
to
just talking about the
80.
famine. I'm talking about the famine, let alone the
This is
5 or
just-
6
yeah.
million who were killed during the
Famines
Civil
happen
War.
all around the
And,
world.
the landowners
Famines
were
happen
slaughtered
in-
by the tens
So
of
tell me
thousands.
how
I've
many
read the
people
Mao's
died.
books as well.
Neil,
How
if
many
we-
people died in famines in Africa? How many people died in famines in
No.
in
This was
India?
deliberate, wasn't it?
You know,
It was
this is
complete
not-
message, the
Who says it's
collectivization,
deliberate?
just as you had in
You mean
Eritrea
you have a
and
policy?
the Ukraine.
You mean you had a policy that led, under some circumstances, to famine? I'm not disputing that.
Yeah, and
I'm
how many died
disputing the
then?
numbers. I'm disputing
Yeah, I'm
the
talking
numbers
about
you've
numbers.
given.
It's at least
Yeah, but
40 million just in
you're
that
sucking them
period.
out your thumb. You're sucking
No, I'm
them out
not.
your
No, I'm
thumb.
not. Oh, I can send you the books, matey. It's no problem at all.
Well, I just asked
You
for a
can
source.
discover
That's
this
all.
yourself.
If you're
I
going,
mean, I read the
I'm
left
just
stuff.
saying.
You obviously don't read anything else from any other angle than the left, it would appear to me. But that's your choice. Honestly.
I mean, let's get past this. This is I just wanted to make a point about sources. If you're going to make a claim as extravagant as 80 million dead, you normally
Black
have
Book
to
of
provide
Communism.
some source.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's the Black Book of
The
Communism?
Black Book of Communism.
The Black Book of Communism.
Yes, the Black Book of Communism. Claims are in there.
What it claims is the Black Book of Communism is that 80 million died in all the communist countries, not China. And therefore, that disproves
No, it actually
your own
states that
argument
more
a
than
minute.
200 million died in another communist country.
And it's just, as you say, a black book. So it's just a list of every person who died in those countries, tot them all up and claim that they died due to communism. It's just a lot of nonsense.
If I can just, if we're going to go down this route of where you ask for
I don't want to
information
go
and
down
you
that route.
dismiss
It's a waste of
information
time.
because you
It's
disagree
a
with
waste
it,
of time. No, because
that's
you
not
have the
a
source.
fair-based argument. And I don't think anybody should be getting upset or emotional because we won't resolve anything through
So move
emotional
on to other
arguments.
subject. Deal with your
I think there is a
arguments.
moral argument here to be had, rather than trying to defame and undermine the other, which is what's happening here, Haiku. I don't think that's correct.
No, I just
I think we have to look at the moral argument for the embassy and see whether it is necessary or not,
Yep.
and whether the embassy in Portland Road is an old building or not. They're all old buildings in London. It's an old city. I see no reason why even America should have a mega embassy in my country, let alone China. And I would rather prefer America spied on us than China.
There is a good reason that the Chinese should be worried about the security of their embassy. The Americans in
Why?
1999 blew up the Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia because they thought the Chinese, aspersions again, the Chinese are supporting the Yugoslavs. And so the Western powers blew up the Chinese embassy or bombed the Chinese embassy. So the Chinese have got perfectly good reasons for being worried about blowing up. An embassy, by the way, is a territory of that country. It's the territory of that country. So the fact that the Americans have been doing this type of thing, and that the British, the Chinese of course have to be worried that the British and the Americans will spy on them. That's the point. And the reason why, just one earlier point, why the Chinese,
in my country,
just one second, why the Chinese are developing more rapidly than other countries in the world, and more rapidly in particular than the less developed countries is because they have used a method. You pointed out the idea of them taking intellectual property. What they do is they accumulate resources from the private sector in order to facilitate economic development, to raise the living standards of the people. And they've done, the reason why they're hated is because they've achieved what no other country has done in raising the living standards of the people at a rate and speed unprecedented, and scale and speed unprecedented in human history. And that, of course, is leading them to gain authority around the world, in Africa, in South America, in India as well. And it's the fear of the imperial countries, Britain, America, and Europe, that these countries, South America, Africa, India, if they were to emulate what the Chinese had done, they would eventually become developed countries, which the Western powers have prevented them from doing for the last 200 years.
Yeah, all right. If I can just pop in there, but on the banking side, what China did, like in the late 1970s, they took on the ideas from the Japanese. Okay, it was Deng Xiaoping, I think it was, went over to China, to Japan, and learned from them about the different banking system that they utilized. So there is a difference in that. That is correct, but that is not something that is Chinese. That was developed by the Germans and the Japanese. Hence why after World War II you had that massive increase in the economic performance after being flattened, having had their countries flattened, where Germany and Japan both progressed very rapidly because they had a different banking system. Now, you're correct, Heiko, about that growth was massive in China because they had learned from these other folk, and they have not followed the same pattern of going under the Fed in America, etc. I don't disagree with that part of it. What we're saying, though, is the facts are quite clear. It was a book called Tombstone, Heiko, you could have a look at, by Jiang Jiming, I think his name was. Tombstone, great book on this. Also, it's Frank Dicotter is the trilogy, which will explain the numbers to you. So, I mean, I'm listening to you, but I suggest, you might find there are things you can learn from other people as well. And those are two, the trilogy is good, and so is the Tombstone. And they make quite clear that the numbers are very evident, and to then turn around and try and deny those numbers is, I'd say, it's not the best way of arguing your case.
Can I just butt in? Sorry.
Yeah.
Before we think we're not in the same room. With none of my whiskey left, I can tell you that. David, I just want to know what your thoughts are, the long-term goals of China with the UK and vice versa.
Well, you have to remember that the Chinese constitution says that they have a birthright to become the global superpower, and that they have to make every country communist, and it states that in their constitution. So it's when you speak to China, you've got two types of Chinese people. You've got the Chinese people who are thoroughly on board with the communist project, and it's an increasing number of Chinese people who are not on board with the communist project. And I've spoken to lots of expat Chinese about this, and a lot of actual Chinese about this as well. I've been very, very deep in the Chinese community for about 20 years. I've employed Chinese people before. We've had conversations at length about this. So you don't develop what China is developing unless you have global ambitions. You've got to remember that they are building bases everywhere that they can. They're trying to gain strategic leverage in ports around the world. They're not stupid. They've very much learned from the East India Trading Company and how the British built their empire. And look, you have to remember that the Chinese, on average, are the most intelligent nation in the world. Like I said, I've spent great amounts of time around them, and their ability to create genius solutions for problems is great. I've witnessed it. So I have no issues with recognizing that they're an intelligent nation. I doubt the motives of the Chinese Communist Party, because I believe the Chinese Communist Party was essentially founded on lies, and they operate within that way. So I don't really trust them. The United Kingdom is slowly becoming a vassal of China, and this mega embassy essentially makes, the United Kingdom the foreign branch, the Western branch of the Chinese Communist Party. There isn't a need for an embassy that big. There is no credible threat from the Uyghurs. They're, a bunch of Muslims who, being forcibly erased within China. There's no credible threat from the American government. Yugoslavia was a destabilized nation. There was more going on in Yugoslavia wasn't just some peace-loving country. So I don't buy that argument from Heiko at all. The British government would never allow a foreign embassy to be blown up within its own country. As Heiko stated, an embassy is a territory. It is, that's what it is. So essentially, building this mega embassy is essentially China claiming that they have sizable territory and influence within the United Kingdom. Because, to go back to this argument of, well, Britain is in America's lap, then why hasn't America got a mega embassy then? If that is the case, why hasn't America got access to our IP and our data systems? Why isn't MI5 raising concerns about America? Now, I have had concerns about certain American administrations in the past, but I think it is disingenuous and it's a false equivalence to try and equate the two together. China likes to be diplomatically aggressive and aggressive behind the scenes, but also play the victim when it's attacked. And I think, to give Heiko the benefit of the doubt, he is echoing those sentiments, and that's fine. That's his opinion. But I personally think Chinese ambition is to have more influence and power, but almost like a soft power. In 1969, China and Russia went to war over a piece of territory in the northeastern part of China, and it was a stalemate because the Chinese had more bodies, but the Russians had better technology. And since then, their strategy has been to not directly engage the West in any military conflict. They're obviously bolstering their military. If they're going to make a move for Taiwan, it'll have to be shortly. And we just have to see how that goes, because China is a problem. There's a reason why they want Greenland. There's a reason why America wants Greenland. They have a refueling point before they get to US territorial waters. The Chagos is the same. China isn't doing the Belt and Road initiative out of the benefit and the goodness of its heart. It's not like the Christian duty or the white man's burden that the imperialists in Europe had. And again, the claim that China's lifting the African nations up, that we subverted them from. The African nations weren't developed in 5,000 years until we got there. We lifted them essentially from the Stone Age into the Industrial Revolution of the 1950s. So they've had plenty of time to sort of make roads on their own. China's motive will be for minerals, resources, fuel, and strategic. It always is. Any country that isn't operating under those guises, and that includes my own country, is being completely foolish. You have to exert your influence wherever you can to protect your own nation. I just doubt the sincerity and the charitableness of the Chinese Communist Party greatly.
Can I just want to ask you, Neil, because you're ex-military, who's a greater threat to world peace? Now, we just look at Trump, for example, and truly, I'm quite shocked at this year. And late last year, we have his involvement with the Middle East. We have his involvement with all sorts of countries. Venezuela. He wants to get involved in Cuba. Wants to get involved in Mexico. He wants Greenland. So he'll have there's going to be some interesting times with Europe, and if they have any soldiers at all. But we see that Donald Trump, the peacemaker, is certainly working at the other end of the scale. And then we have China, and I'm not standing up for China. China do it. I mean, they're terrible people. I can see that because they give countries money. They don't go in and take it, and I can see that. So, which is at this moment, which is a greater threat to world peace? Is it President Trump and the US, or is it China?
Well, I think you've got the issues with the left and the right remain. You've got the communists versus the capitalist nations, what you want to call them, free enterprise nations. And I think the issue has been that we've had very much, strip and bare capitalist nations in the past, obviously, and that's, of recent times and continues. And obviously, when you're looking at what Trump is doing now, there's some kind of move away. I mean, he's even threatening the Fed now. So you've got that old system is creaking, and you've got this kind of changeover of elites. If you study Moscow and Pareto and you understand these rotations of the people at the top, you're seeing that in the West. And I think that the old system in the West is falling apart really under the stresses of the new order that they were trying to implement. And I think Trump is not completely happy with that system, that they want to implement, and that's why you've got a lot of the elite, as it were. Barack Obama's even bought a place in London now, and you've got this move of the deep state types, I believe, moving more into Europe. That's the issue with this Europe versus America thing, partially, and so Trump is trying to implement a slightly altered system in the States, but it means a move of the power elite who were existing in the States being pushed aside to some extent. So it's a complex issue, and to just address it left and right is not the way to go. You've almost got this three-part system now, and there's a split in the West that is being, pushed by Trump to rebalance, as it were. And the communists will always be communists. They always want one world. The Americans, naturally, is America first nowadays, and so he's still looking for his power center to be, evolved and to reduce the reliance on the other nations around the world. But he wants to protect America, presumably, obviously, with all of the issues with Greenland and the resources and the access to all of that. Then he wants to protect that from obviously the encroachment from Russia in the north and China and its influences. So it's extremely complicated, and it's going to be interesting to see how it all works out. But obviously, I think America is in a very big transition, and I think the full depth of that we won't see revealed for some time yet.
I actually think we have a major crisis on our hands when it comes to what America is doing right now. Because, and you mentioned Russia. If you were negotiating peace with Donald Trump, you want to make sure you didn't tell him where you were, because he'll go for your hammer and tong. And look at even in Iran when he was negotiating peace. He also knew that Israel were about to bomb the crap out of Iran too. So not a very trustworthy person on the world stage. That is probably one of the disadvantages of Donald Trump, is that no one trusts him. Heiko, what do you think?
Coming back to the question that Neil was just raising about, if you like, systems, China's social system, I believe, still retains the core elements that existed, for example, in the Soviet Union. In other words, state planning and public ownership. And I think the banks being publicly owned is an important component of that, because it allows the state to transfer resources from the private sector into the state sector and invest those resources for the development of infrastructure, roads, railways, and other welfare resources for the population. And that's, if you like, the key. They have differed in that respect in relation to the Soviet Union, and they've proven that a planned economy based on public ownership can outstrip the Western capitalist model. And in particular for those countries that are less developed and have been held back by the history of imperialism and colonialism and economic, in a real form or a military form and an economic form. And now we're seeing the return of the old form of imperial conquest and imperial domination that the 19th century was characterized by the dominance of Britain, and the Americans are attempting to do the same type of thing. They have an internal battle amongst themselves between the imperial powers, between Europe and the United States in particular, but also against Japan. And these are the leading capitalist economic powers. But then the ultimate game is a battle between the social classes, and China represents, in that respect, the rising working classes that Marx talked about 150 years ago or 170 years ago. The idea that the working classes would one day exercise power and control over society through public ownership and eventually democratic control. Well, that idea is fundamentally what's at the core of why China is successful, because it's been able to show that public ownership and planning are able to develop. The democratic control, I believe, will come at one stage or another inevitably. And that democratic control will not be like the Western democratic control, which is a farcical democratic control. They say you have democratic control, but in actual fact, you don't have democratic control. Everything is controlled by the oligarchs, the billionaires, and their allies. And therefore, the sham of capitalist democracy is falling apart. And the consequence of that is you're seeing this international conflict between the different powers and so-called democracies backing Israel's genocide against the Palestinian people. In the name of what? What justification, possible justification, do they have for that? They have none, and therefore the belief in democratic capitalism is disintegrating even in the advanced capitalist countries, particularly amongst the youth.
I just want to ask David this one. Carl Jar works at a UK column, pro-China influencer, probably propagandist. No Carl, by the way, so he won't talk to me for a while. But he says that the UK is not a competitor nor an adversary of China. The UK shouldn't overestimate its impact on the global scene. China is a fact, a mega trend for the UK to live with and get along with. What's your views on that, David? You seem to have frozen at the moment. Are you there?
We should be a competitor and an adversary. It's that simple.
We actually have a really bad connection. Can you do me a favour? I'll go to Neil
Am
here.
I still there?
Yes, you are, but you probably just need to reconnect. So why don't you just reconnect? I'll go to Neil, and Neil, get your views on that. What's your views on that, Neil, from Carl Jar?
Yeah, well, I was going to just quickly address what Heiko was saying about, the publicly, controlled issues of the economy. In fact, all they did was, the Chinese, they handed over the right to, make money to the Chinese. They set up all the banks, provincial banks all over the country. So it's not a planned system that has done this. The plan was simply copying what Japan and Germany had done, which was to hand over control in terms of directing funding into the hands of entrepreneurs who would get on and build the systems, very much at village and regional level as well. So it was planned in those terms, but that was just what the Japanese have been doing for 30 years before the Chinese learned from them. No, sorry, but I have actually forgotten what your thing was, the point you were making. I was going to answer Heiko first.
Yeah, I just want to the UK is not a competitor nor an adversary of China. The UK shouldn't overestimate its impact on the global scene.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks. Yeah.
So China is in fact a mega trend for the UK to live with and get along with.
Well, obviously, in diplomacy, you're always trying to get on with other countries, large ones, obviously, that have a lot of power. You've got to take those things into account. But the system differences in terms of, the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, they're all immensely wealthy, and Xi is the son of, another royal member of the party, you might say, from the 40s and the 30s. So all of this about, the differences, there is not. There is an elite that is running China. They are becoming billionaires in the Communist Party too, from control of the system. It's no different. It's a power elite issue, as you find in the West. There is no the only democratic country that you can really look at around the West as well, in terms of the real democracy, is Switzerland anyway, where the people have control of the system through the right to call referendums on pretty much anything. So that is the way the West will head, in my opinion, as it wants to get more democratic after this crisis. And obviously America has got a lot of rights to referendums at state level, but it does not have it at national level, and never had a national referendum. But the Swiss are voting 4 times a year on various referendums. So the development for democracy is not to continue with the current system. And even Reform UK now are backing the right to call referendums, as a part of the policy that they're going to be offering. So that's Nigel Farage has been backing that particularly. So I think that this crisis that we're living through will hopefully see, proper growth of democracy. There's been that move towards it in China in terms of allowing the people to make money and to create, the economy that they have. But they're still under oligarchy. It's just called the CCP. We have it across the West to a large extent as well. And I think it's only through more democratic controls that the Reform are talking about now and will offer, where we will have this right to call referendums. So we'll get a system that satisfies, Heiko on the left, because the people are taking control, more so day to day, and those on the right that, we've defeated communism. That's my thinking.
I just want to go back to David because he popped out just to do a reboot. Thank you for that, David. Tell us about, if you know enough about it, the Chagos Islands. You've got China. They've got their fingers in it. And we see that Keir Starmer, I mean, the last country he wants to look after is the UK, of course. And China have also have the fingers in Mauritius and Diego Garcia and stuff. How important is Chagos for the UK, and where is it going wrong?
So, I mean, the easiest way to sum it up is that the Chagos Islands is an important refueling point for the British and the Americans to access territorial waters in the South China Sea. So you can just reverse that and see why it is important. So you tie all these things in: the mega embassy, the Chagos, the opposition to America having great influence in Greenland. You look at the fact that Keir Starmer is consistently saying he's aligns with Beijing, and you can see that this man is essentially an asset for the Chinese government within the United Kingdom, as Joe Biden was, which they admitted publicly. So I think where's it going wrong? It's going wrong that we have, for successive decades since the 1950s, in increasing numbers, had people within government of either party who are aligned with the Fabian socialists, and whose primary aim is to essentially drive Britain towards being a communist country. But over decades, not overnight, like it happened in China and Russia. So we have people whose starting point is not the benefit of the nation, but the benefit of the other, the benefit of an outside state, an outside interest. If it was, you wouldn't give up anything. I'm not going to give up a room in my house to Heiko or Neil or you or anybody. It's my house. If you want it, you come and get it, right? So why they would give up any territorial property for the benefit of another nation, and China will be eyeing this, make no mistake. I think it's madness. Might is right. And we know this because society and countries are just a macrocosm of the microcosm of the individual basis. A bar full of men doesn't break out into violence because the men understand what that means. So you have this power sharing, this equilibrium that goes on within the strength of nations too, where you have to have opposing forces to create a balance. So you can't have any power that is too big or it becomes a problem. If, let's just say, the Chinese Communist Party survive, which I don't think they will the next decade, but you cannot have them run unfettered into Western waters, either through the Chagos or through Greenland. It's just not possible. If you want the West to survive, because China is not the West, and China isn't even Chinese culture anymore. It's this weird hybrid, this futuristic dystopia looking thing that is it's culturally hollow, what the Chinese Communist Party are creating. I don't want the West to look like China. It's just a simple fact. I don't want them to have any influence here. I adore the ancient culture profoundly, but I simply don't want the Chinese government to have that level of influence over any part of British territorial waters or land. So it is a huge problem. Where it's going wrong is that Keir Starmer doesn't have a backbone. He's clearly compromised. He's clearly put there not as a prime minister, but as a branch manager. And it's becoming increasingly clear over time that he's essentially the branch manager for the Western branch of the Chinese government.
And when you look at the Chagos Islands, you can't just blame Starmer. It goes right back to the Tories. And if you look at...
Yes, absolutely. Because you've got Fabian socialists on both sides.
Yeah.
There are Fabians within the Tory party, just as they are within the Labour Party. And there is virtually... They are indistinct in policy and in action. They are both left-wing, both of them. It's laughable to say that either of them are anywhere near the centre, for instance.
Can I ask you, Neil, just your views on both sides in the Tories or Reform UK, which is basically the Tories. They're going to have the same ones there again. They don't understand, do they? Both sides don't understand the importance of security. And whether we agree with the decisions of Donald Trump, he actually does understand security. And I don't agree that's how a president should act on the world stage, but he understands security. He understands what is important to keep, inverted commas, the West in good shape. What's wrong with your politicians, Neil? Because you have the Tories and you have Starmer. Is there anything else they can give away? Maybe Scotland?
Yeah, well, we've got elections coming up this year, Scotland and Wales. Maybe they'll decide to hand them away because they're not worth keeping. But no, seriously, obviously, you've got the Uni Party has grown over the years. You've got the whip controls everything more, completely. I remember even hearing Galloway talking about, at least in the early days when he was in Parliament, there were a more individualistic type of, MP, but they've all become stamped with the same, stamp nowadays. And that's why it's collapsing, actually, because that's why you've got this sudden rise of reform, because it's offering something different from that uni-party leftward shift that David was talking about. But, I think people won't realise it, maybe, but that right to referendums that Farage is talking about, and recently again, I think it's 10th of November, making the point that this will change their system because the people will start taking charge, and it won't be the proletariat alone, Heiko. It will actually be, the people in a democracy having that right to call those referendums. And I think it's something that's moving under our feet, but it's a reaction to this uni-party problem that we've got. They're all pretty useless, but reform at least is offering a path out of this mess. That's my opinion.
Heiko, what do you think? I think reform, by the way, in my humble opinion, I think Nigel Farage is a celebrity game show host in waiting, because truly he's not to be trusted. He goes back on his word. He's all Nigel, and we can see what's happening. We have a very dear friend of ours, James Freeman, who's used to be with the EU Parliament for a short while, and also used to work for TNT Radio, and a friend of Basil's, Heiko, who you would know very well, and marvellous person, by the way, Basil. But he's appalled, and many others are appalled with the almost the about turn from Nigel Farage. If you don't have a good opposition, it lets loose a very bad government. What needs to be done, and how do they understand international diplomacy and international security? How do you make them do that?
I think this still comes back to the question and connects in with the question that we started with, and that's the question of China and the question of class. So a communist system, as David said, is supposed to be based upon the working classes taking over the running of society. So I tried to point that out because it's a background issue. The only person who sort of eloquently expresses this from the opposing standpoint in the mainstream is this guy, Steve Bannon. At least Bannon explains about the working classes and the crisis in society being related to that. He does it from the standpoint of the billionaires and the elite, trying to appeal to the working classes to mobilize against the layer of people associated with the whole historical trajectory of capitalism in the last 30, 40 years or since the 1970s. But capitalism internationally, particularly the largest, most powerful imperial powers, is in crisis. It's been in a long-term economic decline. Since 2008 in particular, there's been this stagnation in the global capitalist economic system, while China has been consistently expanding. And that's one of the reasons why I began to do intensive study for my PhD, which was done in 2018, about the nature of the Chinese system. I disagree with what Neil said about the nature of the Chinese system. I think the Chinese system is a planned economy, and it's an illustration of this rebalancing of power back towards the working classes, which is beginning in China and has another manifestation in the Western world, in that everyone wants to appeal to the working classes because they know at some stage there will be a national and a global rebellion by the working classes against the elites and those in power. And so everyone starts talking about elites and and deep states and all these type of things. In fact, what it under the surface of all this, underneath the whole thing, is an explosive discontent amongst the working classes, manifested in all sorts of different ways, sometimes in anti-migrant sentiment, sometimes in anti-woke sentiment, sometimes in anti-lockdown sentiment. It's a whole combination of factors that are breaking down the existing ideological framework of power that the capitalist system instilled into the minds of the people over the last 30, 40 years, and which has been gradually disintegrating, driven by the real economic crisis in society, driving down the living standards of the workers and the middle class, by the way. And with the development of AI, large numbers of those who thought they were secure will also be battered to the winds. And, and Nigel Farage is just, in my opinion, is likely to be elected, yes. But I think that won't last very long because the mood, he won't be able to satisfy the working classes, even if he calls multiple referendums in order to distract them by throwing dust in their eyes. And just the same as Donald Trump, who has been incapable of raising the living standards of the American working classes and middle classes. He's mainly raised the living standards, or better said, the wealth of the super elite, like Elon Musk and co. He's mainly done that. And in order to distract from his inability to drive the capitalist system to raise the living standards of the working classes, he goes to war around the world and becomes a neocon in the old mode and an agent of the Zionists from Israel. And so the same pattern will manifest itself in Britain. Nigel Farage he already is an agent or a stooge for the Israel lobby. He will blow up in anger against the Chinese. But he's already sitting in Davos with the rest of the gang who've been ruling over Europe and America for decades. He will become an institutional representative. And then, of course, when that crisis happens and Farage begins to lose his authority, then, of course, you'll have even more reactionary forces gathered around Nick Ticconi and Tommy Robinson. And then I believe there will emerge a new working class power from below. But I think that's something that's going to happen on an international scale. That's the trajectory that I would foresee.
Look, we are running out of time. I'll stay with you at this stage, Heiko, if you don't mind. What does China want? What do you think China wants with the UK?
China would like to do trade relations with the UK and keep up the connection that enables them to develop their technological development, infrastructure development, and so on. I think they're probably wrong in thinking that the British have got much to offer. But they put their fingers in a lot of pies. Belt and Road Initiative and stuff like that is about infrastructure development to facilitate global influence and global development. But I don't think Britain will play as big a role as some people in China might think they will, or some people in Britain even think they will. And a lot of Chinese elites send their children to British universities, and so I think they have a certain layer of people who have that belief that Britain will play a significant role. I think they're probably wrong on that, but nevertheless, that I think is part of it.
David English, what does China want with the UK?
Influence. China, the UK is the gateway to Europe. You conquer the UK, you conquer Europe. Everything flows through the United Kingdom, whether it's financially, intelligence-wise. And you get a hold of that, you essentially have, Britain is and has been since Suez essentially a vassal of the United States. We're just looking at the United States as a Christian country, because if it had been a communist country, it would be in terrible, terrible situation. And just to further that point, you have to remember that Karl Marx initially referred to the working class as the lumpen proletariat, which means useful idiot. And that's what he thought of the common man. But China essentially wants to get access to this gateway into Europe. If they control the United Kingdom, they control Europe. And China will do it softly because they don't like direct confrontation. They've always been very, very cowardly. The CCP, that is, Mao's Great March was actually running away from the Japanese and the KMT because he didn't want to fight. So this is essentially, they will do everything softly behind the scenes, using power and influence, blackmail, manipulation, and such forth. And we know this because there's been MPs been caught in blackmail scandals in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, who are all being blackmailed by the Chinese government. So, yeah, it's pretty easy. If they get us, then America is essentially isolated. And America is trying to do the same. America is trying to isolate China. It's, they've got Maduro. I imagine that at some point Cuba will go, Iran will go, and they'll keep picking off China's allies, and they'll probably do something to push Russia to one side, because they want to isolate China so they can take on the Chinese Communist Party and hold them accountable for everything they've done since 1949.
Neil Petrie, can I just ask you what's your views on what China wants with the UK? And I actually should ask what the UK wants with China, but that will keep us here for another 20 or 30 minutes at least. So what does China want with the UK, Neil?
Well, China wants power around the world, as we've heard, with their aims, the Communist Party, and this, lumpen proletariat taking on everything. It's all a front again for another group called the CCP. There's 90 million of them, I think, and they're the ones who've got the access to the power and the benefits of the system. So it's just another elite system, just as ours has largely been, with the Norman yoke, or whatever you want to call it. But it's not about just the workers, and it's not about the elite. It's about, the UK as a nation pulling together. And so I think, what Nigel Farage is offering when he's talking about this right to referendums is a rebalancing, it's a paradigm shift really in democracy. It's actually, trying to pull together semi-direct democracy really with representative and direct democracy combined, like the Swiss have. And so the people will control the nation, and you'll get that stability that we've not had. The kind of imperial ambitions will, largely obviously disappear around the world, hopefully, and that everyone can just get along, as best they can. But they'll be controlling their own states, because it's nation states that we want, not this international lumpen proletariat ruled group, or this oligarch-led left lot from America, and that's where we're heading. And, I like Heiko laughing, but the reality is this is the first time ever in our history we've got a party leader offering people the right to control this country, which will mean the majority will have the say instead of just a tiny elite from Eton or a tiny elite from, the Fabian Party. That's it. So we want the people to have control through the system, and that's what I believe will happen.
Okay, that's about it. We could go on forever, but I'm sure you'll be in trouble. I'll be in trouble. Neil, if somebody wants to find out more about you, how do they do that?
You can find me at, in fact, Direct Democracy Right Now is a website you can find me at. If you just write to the info address of that, ddrightnow.com, so it's info at that address. And it's all about the implementation of the Swiss-style system, in Britain and eventually elsewhere, hopefully.
And Dr. Heiko Khoo, if somebody wants to find out more about you, how do they do that?
You could go to markswalks.com, come on my walking tour. You could look up heikokhoo.substack.com, or you could go to the Subject Access website on YouTube.
Absolutely brilliant. Got to have you back again too. And David English, got to have you all back again. A fantastic discussion. David, if somebody wants to find out more about you, how do they do that?
I spend my life on X, so if they just go to @David.English, they can kind of find me there for spicy memes and other hot takes.
Yeah, we're not liked by X. We still do it, but they don't like us. We're at tier 1. Either go away or jump into a volcano, whichever comes first. But anyway, that's life. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being part of this panel. This has been The Protagonist, and this is The World Today.